Ace Frehley said nothing. He turned off his pedals. He set his guitar to clean tone. And he played. 90 seconds later, the producer was crying in the corner of the studio. The year was 1978. Electric Lady Studios in Greenwich Village. Studio B. The walls still held the ghost of Jimi Hendrix, who built this place 8 years earlier and died before he could fully use it. Ace Frehley sat on a wooden stool in the center of the live room. His Les Paul rested across his lap. The guitar was plugged into a single Marshall amp, no pedal board, no rack effects, no studio wizardry. Just guitar, cable, amplifier. Across the room, standing near the control booth window, was Martin Kellerman. Producer. 20 years in the business. Credits on albums that had gone gold, platinum. A man who had worked with guitar legends, who knew tone, who understood the architecture of rock and roll. Martin had a theory. He'd been developing it for months, discussing it with other producers over drinks at the bitter end, refining it in late-night phone calls with session musicians. The theory was simple: Ace Frehley was a showman, not a guitarist. The makeup. The space persona. The smoking guitar. The pyrotechnics. It was all theater. Strip away the effects, the production, the spectacle, and what remained? Martin believed he knew the answer. Nothing. Today was the test. Kiss was on hiatus. The individual members were recording solo albums, a decision that would either prove their individual talents or expose their limitations. Ace had been assigned to Electric Lady with Martin producing. The label wanted to know what Ace Frehley sounded like without Gene Simmons' bass anchoring him, without Paul Stanley's rhythm guitar supporting him, without the Kiss machine surrounding him. Martin had spent the first 3 days of sessions watching Ace work. The guitarist would set up elaborate pedal chains, flanger, phaser, delay, distortion stacked on distortion. He'd spend an hour dialing in tones. He'd play riffs that sounded massive, cosmic, otherworldly. It's all effects, Martin had told his assistant engineer the night before. Take away the toys and there's nothing there. Just wait. Tomorrow we'll find out. This morning, Martin had made his decision. Ace, he'd said as they set up for the day's session, I want to try something. No effects today. Just you and the amp pure tone. Let's hear what you actually sound like. The control room had gone quiet. The assistant engineer, Danny, had stopped adjusting microphone placement. The tape operator had looked up from his console. Ace had been adjusting his guitar strap. He'd looked at Martin for exactly 3 seconds. No expression. No protest. No explanation. Then he'd walked over to his pedal board and, one by one, turned off every effect. Click. 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 The green and red lights went dark. He'd returned to his stool, set the Les Paul on his lap, and adjusted the volume knob on the guitar itself. Nothing else. Just the guitar's natural output running straight into the Marshall. Ready when you are, Ace had said quietly. Ace didn't defend himself. He never did. Martin stood in the control room, arms crossed, a small smile on his face. This was it. The moment of truth. 3 days of watching this, Space Ace, hide behind effects, and now, finally, they'd hear the reality. Danny the engineer looked uncomfortable. He'd been in sessions with Ace before, on earlier Kiss recordings. He'd seen something Martin hadn't. But Danny was 24 years old and Martin was the producer, so Danny said nothing. Whenever you're ready, Ace, Martin said through the talkback mic, his voice echoing into the live room. Ace nodded once. He closed his eyes. His fingers found their position on the fretboard. Nothing elaborate, just a simple resting place on the lower strings. And then he played. The first note came out of the Marshall clean. Pure. No distortion to hide behind. No effects to color the tone. Just Ace Frehley's fingers pressing a string against the fret, and the electromagnetic pickups translating that vibration into sound. The note sustained. Ace bent it slightly, a quarter tone then back. His finger moved almost imperceptibly, but the note breathed. It lived. Martin's smile began to fade. Ace played a second note. Then a third. He wasn't playing a riff. He wasn't playing a solo. He was playing something else entirely. A melody so simple it seemed impossible. Notes that connected to each other like a conversation no one else could hear. There was no speed. No technical flash. No showing off. Just music. Pure, patient, undeniable music. Danny the engineer leaned forward in his chair, his hands flat on the console. He'd stopped breathing. Martin stood frozen, his arms slowly uncrossing, falling to his sides. Ace continued playing. His eyes remained closed. His body barely moved, just his fingers, just his hands, just the subtle shift of his weight on the stool as he followed wherever the melody wanted to go. 30 seconds had passed. The notes weren't complicated. A blues scale, mostly. Basic intervals. Things any guitarist could technically play. But the way Ace played them. The space between the notes, the way each one emerged and faded, the emotional weight somehow embedded in simple quarter-tone bends, it was something else entirely. It was the sound of someone who didn't need to prove anything. Subscribe and leave a comment, because some moments only make sense when we remember them together. 60 seconds. Martin's hand moved to his face. His fingers touched his cheek. He'd worked with guitar legends. He'd recorded solos that made magazines. Top 100 lists. He'd sat in rooms with players who had technique that defied physics. But this was different. This was a man playing guitar like it was the only language he'd ever needed to speak. The melody shifted. Ace moved up the neck, not in a flashy run, but in a slow, deliberate climb. Each note was chosen. Each note mattered. There was no excess. No waste. Every sound served the feeling. And the feeling was... Martin couldn't name it. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't sadness. It was something older than both. Something fundamental. 75 seconds. Danny had tears on his face. He didn't wipe them away. He just sat there, watching through the control room glass as Ace Frehley, the guy everyone dismissed as a showman, the guy with the makeup and the gimmicks and the smoking guitar, revealed what had been there all along. The tape was rolling. No one had called for a take. No one had counted in. This wasn't supposed to be a recording. This was supposed to be a test. But Danny had hit record anyway, instinctively, knowing that something was happening that needed to be captured. 90 seconds. Ace played a final note. He let it sustain, bending it slightly upward, then releasing the bend and letting the note return to its natural pitch. He held it there. Held it until the sound began to fade naturally, the tube amp compressing gently, the note disappearing into silence not because Ace stopped it but because sound itself has limits. Then silence. Complete silence. Ace opened his eyes. He looked down at his guitar, adjusted the straps slightly, and waited. In the control room, Martin Kellerman stood with his hand over his mouth. His eyes were wet. His throat was tight. He was a 47-year-old man who had built his career on knowing music, on understanding what made sound work, on being able to articulate the technical and emotional architecture of rock and roll. And for the first time in 20 years he had no words. Away from the spotlight, Ace made a choice no one expected. Danny hit the talkback button, but before he could speak, Martin gently pushed his hand away and pressed it himself. "Ace," Martin said, and his voice cracked. He cleared his throat. Tried again. "Ace, what was that?" Ace looked up at the control room glass. His face showed nothing. No pride. No vindication. No anger at having been tested. "That was guitar," Ace said simply. "No effects." Martin nodded slowly. He pressed the talkback button again. Can you play it again? Exactly like that?" "No," Ace said. Martin's brow furrowed. "No? I don't remember what I played," Ace said. "It just came out." It was the truth. Ace never remembered his improvisations. He didn't plan them. He didn't construct them. They appeared through his hands in the moment, and then they were gone. Like speech, you could record it, but you couldn't recreate it. Martin understood. He'd worked with enough jazz musicians to recognize that quality. The ability to channel rather than construct. He pressed the talkback one more time. We got it on tape. Ace, that's one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. Ace nodded once. Okay. What do you want me to play next? As if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just completely inverted Martin's understanding of who he was as a musician. As if 90 seconds of pure, unadorned playing hadn't just reduced the veteran producer to tears. Martin turned to Danny. Did we capture that clean? Every second, Danny said quietly. Perfect isolation. It's all there. Good. Martin looked back at Ace through the glass. Take 5, Ace. I need a minute. Ace stood up, set his Les Paul on its stand, and walked out of the live room into the hallway. He didn't ask why Martin needed a minute. He didn't press for validation. He just left the room, giving the producer space to process whatever needed processing. What followed silenced everyone in the room. In the control room, Martin sat down in the producer's chair. He put his head in his hands. Danny and the tape operator exchanged glances but said nothing. Play it back, Martin said finally, his voice muffled by his hands. Danny rewound the tape and pressed play. The speakers filled with Ace's playing. The melody, simple, patient, devastating, emerged again from the monitors. Martin listened with his eyes closed, his head still in his hands. When it finished, he was crying. Actually crying. Shoulders shaking slightly. Danny pretended not to notice. I was wrong, Martin said quietly. I've been wrong this whole time. He stood up and walked into a hallway where Ace was sitting on a road case, drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup. Ace, Martin said. Ace looked up. I owe you an apology. Martin's voice was steady now, but his eyes were still red. I thought you were hiding behind effects. I thought if I stripped them away, there'd be nothing underneath. I was testing you. Ace took a sip of his coffee. Said nothing. I was wrong. Martin continued. You're not a showman who plays guitar. You're a guitarist who happens to put on a show. There's a difference. A big one. And I'm sorry I didn't see it. Ace looked at Martin for a long moment. Then he shrugged slightly. Most people don't. Why don't you defend yourself? When people dismiss you as just effects and makeup, why don't you correct them? Ace stood up, set his coffee down on the road case. Because real things don't need defending. They just need playing. He walked past Martin, back toward the live room. You want me to plug the pedals back in now, or keep it clean? Martin almost laughed. Almost. Whatever you want, Ace. Whatever serves the music. Ace nodded and disappeared back into the studio. Martin stood alone in the hallway. He heard Ace begin setting up for the next take, pedals clicking back on, that familiar cosmic tone building. But Martin knew now. Beneath the effects, beneath the makeup, beneath the smoke and theater, there had always been this, a guitarist who didn't need to prove anything because the truth lived in his hands. Share and subscribe, some stories deserve to be remembered. The session continued. They recorded 7 more tracks that day. Some with effects, some without. All of them honest. Martin Kellerman never spoke publicly about that 90-second moment. But he kept a copy of that tape in his personal archive until he died in 2019. He labeled it simply, Ace Clean, the Truth. Years later, session musicians would ask Martin who the greatest guitarist he'd ever recorded was. He never said Ace Frehley's name. He'd just smile slightly and say, the ones who don't need to defend themselves. Ace Frehley never mentioned that day. He didn't need to. Real things don't need defending. They just need playing.